Welcome back to Nifty 50 Photographers. Today's video, I'm going to talk about photographing flowers, especially in conditions like we've got today, glorious sunshine. And you might need to photograph them in harsh sunlight at midday. So I'm going to show you how to cope with that, and I'll show you how to focus them so you get them nice and sharp and a greatly exposed, perfectly sharp photo. First thing I would say is, if you have the chance, choose your time of day carefully. If you can photograph early in the morning, late in the afternoon or early evening and the sun is lower in the sky, you'll get a much nicer quality of light. So that's my first choice. If you can't do that, you need to go and look for some areas of shade. These monkshood or aconitum's are in the shade here behind a wall and the sun is directly behind. So there's a good chance to get some soft diffuse light, and I don't need to worry about the harsh contrasts. So I'll grab a quick shot of those, and then we'll move on to a more challenging subject. This is my setup. I've got my camera on a tripod and I've got it in portrait mode because, as you can see, the flowers behind, they're tall and vertical, and that's the best way to fill the frame. I'm using a 90mm f2.8 macro lens, the Sony G lens. If you'd like to know more about that, I've done a review of this lens. I think it's a great piece of kit. I'll leave a link to that up here. And the other thing I'm doing, I'm going to focus bracket. Now, I have the option, because I'm using a Sony a7R5, of focus bracketing. Set it to take actually 11 shots, because otherwise it'll take probably 30 or 40 to get the whole scene in focus, and that's a bit more than I want to process. It just takes a long time, and you really need some other software other than Photoshop to do that. So I'll do that. Everything is nicely in the shade. The only thing I've got to really worry about is any wind, which will move the flower as I take it. But I'm going to take this shot and I'll process it and show you what it looks like. Let's talk about camera settings. Now, I know this 90mm macro lens performs at its best 2 or 3 stops in from its extreme widest aperture. So I'm going to set f3.5. I'll let the camera make its own mind up about shutter speed. So I'm setting it to aperture priority. I've set my ISO to 100. Now, if you don't have a camera that has the focus bracketing option, then what could you do? Well, the best way to do it is to manually focus and take something like 5, 7, however many shots you feel you can cope with, focusing on different parts of your scene. But make sure you focus on the parts that are closest to you and the ones further away, and then several steps in between. And you can blend them all together in Photoshop or Lightroom later. And if you don't know how to do that, then I'll link to a video that explains all that as well. Now let's move on to a much more complex subject. Here is this sweet briar rose, and it's right in harsh sunlight. Now, if you look around carefully, there are some angles of it that are in the shade, so that would be the obvious one to photograph. Well, let's assume you don't have that option and you have to photograph it in bright sunlight. So what could you do? Well, really the best option is actually to block out the sunlight. So take something with you, like a diffuser. And this is what I've got here. Basically, I'm going to put that between the sun and my subject. So let me try and show you what that does. If I move it round to here, you can see that this photograph, it's actually, you see the bee hovering above it there, is now in the shade. So what I'll do is I'll manually hold that while I take my photograph, put it in the shade, and that'll create this soft light over the rose as I take my shot. Now let me give you just one other really useful tip. See, my tripod is actually on a slope, and what I've done is put the single leg facing down the hill, the other two at the top of the hill, and that stops it falling over towards me, falling down the hill and potentially damaging your camera. There is one other scenario you're highly likely to come across when you're photographing stuff in bright sunlight. That's you're going to get a mixture of shade and sunlight, because some of the shade here has been caused by the flowers and leaves themselves. How do you get around that? Well, you could use a reflector and just reflect in some light to take away the shadows. Hopefully you can see the effect here of what that's doing. And that way, you'd set your camera up on the tripod just as I did before. That way you get rid of the shadows and the brightness. Everything will be bright, and it's that change of contrast which causes more of the problems. This will make a slightly more pleasing photo by having everything in the sunlight rather than a mixture of the two. Well, I hope that's helped you go out and capture some of the beauty perhaps in your own garden or in some more formal gardens that you might be visiting. If you haven't got a reflector or a diffuser, take along just a sheet of white paper would do, or you can get some plastic packaging, thin foam sheet, often used for things like when you're sending photographs to keep them stiff, anything like that, just really something to block the light. Even a piece of clothing would help if you carry an extra jumper or jacket or something with you. So whatever you do, go out and have some fun. Love to see some of those remarkable shots you take of flowers. Why not post them in the Nifty 50 Photographers Facebook page? And in the meantime, have some fun with the camera, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.